So let's go ahead and get started. The initiatives are an important part of California's policy landscape. They date back to the early 1900s when Hiram Johnson put through a bunch of reforms to basically eliminate special interests in California government. The special interests targeted at that time were the railroads. We don't hear as much about the railroads today, but we do hear a lot about special interests. Ironically, the initiative is now sort of demonized as the tool of special interests. And we'll see some special interest legislation on here. In fairness to the initiative, I think you have to look at normal legislation and sort of the level of special interest involvement in normal legislative processes. And in many ways, I think the initiative is probably the most democratic. The initiative was intended as a restraint on the legislature. Bonds have to go through public approval if they're over a certain threshold. Also, tax increases, especially because of Prop 13, local special property or local special taxes. And then it also gives us a venue for amending the Constitution. Now, because California's threshold for qualifying a constitutional amendment as an initiative is relatively low, it's 8% of the signatures in the last gubernatorial election, we get a lot of amendments to the state constitution and some things that we would think of in the state constitution that aren't necessarily amendments. But it's also an opportunity for citizens, and this was one of the main purposes of this, to introduce legislation that, because of the constraints of the legislature, be it special interest or politics or partisanship, don't actually make it to the floor of the legislature. And so we have some proposals on here that are like that. The other thing, and this isn't technically the initiative, it's actually what's called a referendum. We don't have any on this ballot. We're also allowed within 90 days to repeal laws that we find undesirable. So this year's 12 initiatives sort of fall into 4 categories, and I'm going to walk through these. There's 4 bond issues on here that we'll talk about. There's some initiatives that focus on reforming criminal sentencing and criminal issues. There are 3 initiatives that really reflect sort of some of the moral debates that we have going on in California, and we'll look at those. And then finally, there's 3 initiatives that fit into sort of this policy priority setting kind of aspect. So let's look at the bonds. In California, we're required to seek voter approval for bonds. You see here, there are 4 bonds on the ballot. The big one is the rail bonds, Prop 1A. There's Children's Hospital, about $1 billion. There's about $17 billion of new bonds on here. If you add the annual cost of those, just like your credit card, you charge the full amount, and then you pay interest on it, right? But your monthly payments add up to about $1 billion if all 4 of these passed of new money. Now, one of the debates you're going to see through all 4, well, through 3 of these, the 4th one there's really not a lot of debate over, is it's free or it's not free. It doesn't cost anything, it does cost anything. The bottom line is it doesn't cost any official earmarked amount, but the state has to pay for these. Just like you have to make a credit card payment, the state has to make payments on these credit cards. And the annual payments, once these things are fully issued, would be about $1 billion a year. So let's take a look at these 4 initiatives. Before we do that, just to give you a sense of what California's already got outstanding on its credit card, we have just under $130 billion of bonds either issued or authorized at this point. The annual cost of that, the monthly payments on that, will peak sometime in the next 3 or 4 years at just over $6 billion a year of cost, which means our monthly or our annual debt service payments, our credit card payments, if you will, is about $6 billion. So these aren't free dollars. These are sort of the cumulative effect of a lot of the initiatives that have already passed. There's $15 billion of we can't stay within our budget bonds on there that the governor, remember back when Governor Schwarzenegger was first inaugurated, the state was running a deficit. We actually spent the last $3 billion of those dollars in this last fiscal year. So it's a significant amount of money. To give you a sense, per capita, this is about $4,600, $4,700 per person. The next highest state in per capita debt is New York at $2,600. So California is in a pretty high debt position. The state of Louisiana is the only state with a lower credit rating than California, in part because of our outstanding debt, in part because of our dysfunctional budgetary process. And so you get a sense, we're pretty extended. So as we go into this, you're going to get a sense from not only my analysis, but from the voters in general. If you look at polling, people are sensitive to spending. So the first one is Prop 1A. This is the High-Speed Rail Authority. This is a huge initiative. This authorizes $10 billion in bonds. Now, there's been about $100 million plus or minus some change spent on this already. But what it would do is it would fund sort of the first level of property acquisition, design, development to build a rail line between the Transbay Terminal in San Francisco and Union Station in LA. This rail line is intended to be a 200-mile-an-hour plus train, something like the TGV in France, if you've seen that. The overall project cost based 2 years ago was about $45 billion of actual cost. The vision is that this would be shared both between the state and other funding sources like the federal government. Some analyst costs at this point are closer to $65 billion for this project. So there's a debate over sort of what it's going to cost. But recognize for every dollar of bonds that we put out there, we pay about $1 in interest. So even if you had half of this, you're looking at probably $40 or $50 billion in state costs out of the state general fund at some point. The annual operating cost for this thing would be about $1 billion. As is the case with rail proposals, there's a debate over whether ridership is going to be anything near what's anticipated. It's pretty easy, for example, to go from San Francisco to LA on an airplane. If you don't mind getting off the train in Oakland and riding that little shuttle bus to the train station, it's pretty easy to get to San Francisco. It will have an effect, obviously, on the airline industry for that market. But that's the kind of pricing they envision, would be something comparable to it. They just think that it'll be more convenient to take the train. It'd be about a 2-hour trip on the train, which by the time you park and get out of the airport is probably a little bit faster than air transportation. We'll look at the jobs in a second. $9 billion of that $10 billion is focused on the LA-San Francisco leg and is prioritized for that. There is a vision that this project will extend up to Sacramento, down to San Diego, out to Riverside. And about $1 billion of it is for transit agencies to start building the infrastructure related to extending the legs into their communities. Whether the high-speed part of it actually goes through that process or not, it's still not clear. So, what are the arguments for? Well, the big argument for is they estimate somewhere around 600,000 jobs, 150,000 construction jobs, and then another 450,000 jobs, sort of the multiplier effect, the dry cleaners, the materials people that sell them the materials and everything else. Once they add it up, somewhere around 500,000 to 600,000 jobs. There's a sense that it'll reduce congestion. The most fervent argument that's listed in the debate focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Trains obviously have economies of scale. A train of this format would probably, the estimate is that it would be somewhere between 15 to 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions produced for the mile of transit that you have on the train versus going on by car. The no's, the big ones, obviously the direct cost. It's very expensive at a time when the California economy is vulnerable. There's a lot of uncertainty about the costs. 2 years ago, construction costs were relatively high. Today, the construction industry is kind of idle. So it's possible that the medium-term costs, the short-term costs would be lower. In the long to medium term, we expect people to still want to live in California. The population of the Central Valley is expected to blossom. So we actually expect that construction costs will probably be a little bit higher than what we're seeing here. Uncertainty about ridership. If it costs $1 billion a year to operate this thing, how much will ridership be able to offset those costs, or will we end up subsidizing it overall like we do Amtrak? And then finally, is there a need for this project? Given the sort of vertical transportation that we have in California from the Bay Area to LA, a lot of the traffic you see on the roads right now stops in Bakersfield and Tehachapi Pass. It's the truckers, because for some brilliant reason they built all these distribution warehouses in the one part of the state that doesn't have good east-west freeway access, which means that all those truckers, if you go up there, there's the big IKEA and everybody else, they have to drive down to LA, drive across on the 210, and then go up the 15 to get to the 40, or go out the 10 to go east-west. So one of the questions is in fact the transit flow in this state conducive to the development of this kind of a project? In terms of spending, as of September 30th, there's about $500 million raised, mostly from Governor Schwarzenegger in support of this, but also obviously the building councils like this kind of construction project. There's been an inconsequential amount of money raised against it. As of September 30th, they hadn't reported any contributions, but I mean, there are some efforts to at least get a message out. Most of the opposition comes from taxpayer groups who are concerned about spending. Tom McClintock is a big voice for opposition on this.